you again.
Recording in
I really
progress.
so enjoyed being here in November with you guys, and so I was really pleased when Dave invited me to come back. And yeah, it's really wonderful to be with you again. As Jeremy said, I work for a charity called Jubilee Plus, where really we just try and help churches like yours, churches like mine, to be as effective as possible at reaching out to the poorest and most vulnerable in our communities in various different ways. So it doesn't necessarily mean financial poverty, although it really does mean that, but it might mean that they're isolated, vulnerable in any number of different ways. And some of you will know from, I think, when I spoke to you guys on Zoom in, I think, the first lockdown, or maybe it was the second one, that that's my own background. Like, I grew up in relative poverty in Hastings, as Jeremy said, became a Christian when I was 15, completely from a non-church background, didn't quite know what had hit me, either spiritually or, to be honest, in terms of the culture. Because being from my very working class and poorer background, I suddenly became a Christian in this middle-class church, and there were lots of just ways of behaving that I didn't understand at all. So some of them I still don't understand, actually, many, many years on. I just wanted to let you know, so yesterday morning, I think it was, or maybe mid-afternoon, Dave texted me and told me that it is always sunny here. And then about 5 minutes later, there was the biggest downpour. So I'm starting to think that maybe Dave controls the weather somehow, I don't know, or certainly maybe he doesn't control it. But what I want to speak about this morning is God's heart for people in poverty. But specifically to look at, what does it mean if we say God's got a heart for people in poverty? Does it mean all people in poverty? Or does it just mean some people in poverty? How much does it depend on how they got, or how we got into our mess in the first place? How much is God asking us to look at people and think, well, should we help everyone who comes to our door? As Christians, is it literally that if anyone asks for help, we should help them? Or do we need to be a bit more cautious than that? Are there questions we need to ask? Do we need to try and think through, well, whether maybe how you got into this situation is a factor in what sort of help we give you? So I think it's really obvious looking through the Bible that God has always been especially concerned about people in poverty. Poverty was never meant to exist. When God created a perfect world, there wasn't supposed to be any poverty at all, just like there wasn't supposed to be sin or sickness or death. There wasn't supposed to be poverty or injustice or unfairness. Actually, in the perfect world that God created, there weren't any natural disasters. So you couldn't become poor because of, say, famine or an earthquake or things like that. But also, because there was no sin, you couldn't become poor because of my greed or my selfishness or my desire to exploit you. There was no reason in the perfect world why you could end up in poverty. And yet, when sin came into the world, poverty was one of the consequences, along with death, along with sickness, along with suffering. Suddenly there's the capacity for poverty in the world, and it didn't take long before it came, and before people were in need. And there were some who got richer and richer and richer, and some who got poorer and poorer and poorer. And there was this like unfairness suddenly everywhere, where actually there are some who are exploited and oppressed and vulnerable, and others who doesn't seem to matter whether they're good or bad people, but they might just be able to get richer and richer and richer, and everything might work out wonderfully for them, and their life is looks good, looks solid, looks secure, looks wealthy and affluent. And yet for others, it looks like there's just no chance to maybe catch a break, no chance to get on your feet again. I think it's really obvious in the whole Bible that God is concerned about those who have fallen into poverty and those who are trapped in poverty. We're going to look in a minute at Psalm 107, so if you want to turn to it, we will get there in a little bit. But before we get there, I just want to give you a few examples of how God's heart is really clear in the Bible. So one is in the Old Testament, in the law. So in the first few books of the Bible, God sets out how his people should live. God is basically saying, if you want to flourish as a society, here are some rules that you should follow. I don't know about you, I'm not that keen on rules all the time. Sometimes I really like some rules, and sometimes I think I'm such a rule breaker. I think it really depends on pretty much whether I like them or not. If I like a rule, I'm very happy to go along with it. If I don't like a rule, then something in me just rebels and nods enthusiastically about the rebelling part of it. But God sets out rules, and actually when we look at what his rules are, they're so beautiful and wonderful because they're actually all about how we can flourish and thrive together in community as the people of God. Now, there are some rules we may not understand. There are some rules about mildew and fabrics and all sorts of rules like that in the Old Testament that might be harder for us to make sense of. There are some weird rules in our society. Do you know it's actually illegal in the UK at the moment to be drunk in a pub? Isn't that weird? I mean, it's funny that of all the places it's illegal to be drunk, that being in a pub is one of them. And it's illegal today, right now. I mean, we don't really see people get arrested for that, do we? But nevertheless, it is still a law in the UK. It's also illegal to handle salmon suspiciously. I literally have no idea what that means at all, but it is true. It is illegal in the UK to handle salmon suspiciously. It makes me nervous to eat salmon because how will I know if I'm handling it suspiciously or not? There are rules we understand and there are rules that we don't understand. But actually, when we dig deep into the rules that God has set, like I said, so many of them are beautiful. Well, all of them are beautiful and wonderful. Whether we understand them or not, they are given to us as actually a gift for our flourishing. And actually so that the people of God, when we follow them, will look distinctive from all the other peoples around us. So some of those laws, when it comes to poverty, are things like the law to do with gleaning. So gleaning was like if you were a farmer, you'd be gathering up your crops, and as you gathered your crops, some would fall by the wayside. And your tendency might be to think, I need to go back and pick up everything that I've lost because actually I need it for my family, or I need to sell it to make money. And so you'd probably want to go back and pick up everything, but God says, don't do it. God says, whatever falls by the wayside, you're to leave it for those who have no way to get food. One of the laws in the Old Testament that I find fascinating is that God said, don't make a profit on food. Don't make a profit on food. He doesn't say don't make a living selling food. It's important to make that distinction. People, many people make a living from selling food. God says don't make a profit on it. Imagine if that's how our society lived right now. You know, food prices have gone up astronomically, haven't they? And some of that is because the actual price has gone up, but some of it is the profit margins on top of food. And they haven't been reduced. They've stayed the same. In fact, one of the largest supermarkets in this country has just announced that they made £230 billion profit last year. So while food prices are going up, while energy prices are going up, while petrol prices are going up, there's a supermarket in our nation, it won't be the only one, but one that's made £230 billion profit. I can't even really conceive of that amount of money and what that looks like. And obviously all of that wouldn't have been on food. But the fact is, God says don't make profit on food because food's essential. Everyone needs food. So in the heart of God, we see that there's these laws that are for the provision and the protection of the poorest. We see it in the prophets, Isaiah 61, where it says, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor, to those trapped in poverty, to those imprisoned, to those who are brokenhearted, to those who are mourning, those who are grieving. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, anointing me to bring good news to the poor. And Jesus himself took that passage in Luke chapter 4 and says that passage is about me. It's about him. He says in Luke chapter 4, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. He reads that passage. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. And he says this is fulfilled today. Jesus himself at the start of his ministry is proclaiming poverty is a central part of the gospel. It's not a sideshow. It's not something that Jesus gets to when he's got time for it. It's not something that he gets to when he's done all the religious duties. Good news, bringing good news to the poor is what the Spirit has anointed him to do as he comes. And that same Spirit is upon those of us who believe in Jesus today as well. We see it in the Gospels. To be honest, we see it everywhere Jesus goes, who he interacts with, who he spends time with. So much of his time in the Gospels is spent with the people no one else wants to spend time with. Those who are either poor, as in they don't have the means to support themselves, or those who are poor in the sense of they have been pushed out of society and they are not included and they are not welcome and they have been told you need to go and be separate to us. Jesus brings those very people in. I think it's beautiful and it's wonderful that through all the pages of Scripture, I could stand here and I could talk to you about the Psalms and the Proverbs, the letters to the churches, the history books of the Bible, everywhere you look in the Bible. I've probably mentioned this to you guys before, that there's actually a Bible you can buy called the Poverty and Justice Bible that has highlighted every single passage in the Bible that's about poverty and justice. And you can barely turn a page without seeing something highlighted. So if you kind of want to dig into this, but you're too lazy to do it yourself, just get that Bible. To be honest, that's where I started on this. I just bought that Bible so that I could find all those passages really quickly and really easily. But you'll find you can barely turn a page without seeing that God's heart, it seems like God has a bias towards those in poverty, that he has a bias towards those who are vulnerable. He has a bias towards those that no one else is interested in. But how do we apply this today? Because poverty in the Western world looks very different to what poverty would have looked like in the various times and lands of the Bible. You know, I was in San Francisco a few years ago, and I was praying about poverty. I was praying about God's heart and trying to understand, God, is it that I'm supposed to help everyone? Because people are in poverty for different reasons, and poverty looks different around the world. You know, on our TV screens, in particular around things like comic relief, we see these heart-wrenching images of children literally starving to death. Am I supposed to have the same reaction when I see something like that as I am when, as I was walking in San Francisco, I turned a corner. I'd literally just been praying about this, and I saw a guy holding up a cardboard sign that said, "Why lie? I want beer." Am I supposed to, as a Christian, help him or not? I was kind of saying to God, what is my response supposed to be? Because I know what happens in my heart. It's a very different response. And what is on the heart of God? You know, we have headlines in our newspapers and online in the UK that tell us that there are people who are, I'm going to use the words in the headlines, skivers and scroungers. People who are work shy. These are the words that are used in our national media to tell us about some people who are on benefits. Now, I've been on benefits several times in my life. And it's like, does that make me a skiver and a scrounger and work shy? Are the two things automatically linked? I would argue no, and I hope that most of us would argue no. But some people think that is the case. Some people do think that. Even recently, we've had politicians saying that the cost of living crisis will be fine if you just learn to budget properly and you learn to cook more effectively. Is it as simple as that? That actually if you're in poverty, it's your own fault because you don't know how to budget and you don't know how to cook? Again, can it really be that simple? I would argue no. I hope that's going to be obvious. And for any of you who've heard me speak before, I'm sure it is obvious that I would say no. We've also had an energy company that wrote to their customers saying, we know that prices are going up. Here are our suggestions to cope with it. Cuddle your pets, wear more jumpers, and exercise to keep warm. Again, is that the answer? If we just do those things, we'll be all right? How are we supposed to think through these things? Because it's not as simple, is it, as just saying, yeah, just help everyone who comes. That's fine. That's what we'll do. Poverty in the Western world and in our country feels complicated. It feels that it's not quite as simple. So when God says to us, well, the same Spirit that anointed Jesus to bring good news to the poor is on you, what does it mean? Who are we supposed to help? So I said we'll look at Psalm 107. And I think this is going to help us to understand that, yes, God's concerned about people in poverty, but what do we do if it's their own fault? What do we do if it's bad decisions they've made? So it's quite a long psalm. I'm not going to read every verse, but I am going to read a lot of it. So hopefully you'll be able to follow it. I'm going to read it from the NIV, where it says this: "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe." I'm going to skip down to verse 4. "Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. for he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. Some sat in darkness, in utter darkness, prisoners suffering in iron chains, because they rebelled against God's commands and despised the plans of the Most High. So he subjected them to bitter labor. They stumbled, and there was no one to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. For he breaks down gates of bronze, and he cuts through bars of iron. Some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and he healed them. He rescued them from the grave. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell of his works with songs of joy. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest and lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it drew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. I just really love this psalm because we get to see different groups of people coming to God for different reasons. I think there's clear in verses 4 to 9, we get kind of the hungry and the homeless. Those who are in distress because they can't find food and they can't find safe shelter. And as far as we can tell from Psalm 107, it looks like it's not their fault. There's nothing there that blames them for it. It looks like they're just in that situation and they're crying out to God because they've got no other option, no other place where they can find help. And then in verses 10 to 16, we've got the guilty and the imprisoned. And it basically tells us that it is their fault. It says that they've rebelled against God. They've despised the ways of the Most High. So they've gone their own way and they found themselves ending up guilty, imprisoned, trapped. It says they're bound in chains. And they come and cry out to God with no defense for their behavior. No way of basically saying to God, well, it's not my fault, so please will you help me? Yet they cry out to him in their distress. In verses 17 to 22, we've got those, it says they're foolish and they're afflicted because of their own bad decisions. Basically, they're foolish and they're self-damaged. Again, entirely at fault. And yet they come before God and they cry out to him, again, with no plea, no defense of their own, no way of saying to God, it's not our fault, because it says they became fools because they went against the ways of God. And in verses 23 to 32, we get those who are storm-battered, the merchants, the business people, trying to make a living, and the storm comes up. And as far as we can tell, it's not their fault either. As far as we know, it's that this storm comes to them, and in desperation, they cry out to God. These 4 different groups of people, 2 who clearly are at fault, and 2 who look like they're not at fault, as far as we can tell from the passage. And I think there are easy comparisons to make in our own society at the moment. So the first group, the hungry and homeless, there are many in our communities at the minute who are hungry or who are homeless. Homelessness doesn't just mean necessarily rough sleeping on the streets. It could be that you're sofa surfing. Do you know it's predicted that there are going to be an extra 66,000 people who are homeless through sofa surfing in the coming year? 66,000 people. And part of the reason for that is because during the pandemic, the government said that landlords weren't allowed to evict people because there would have been nowhere for them to go. So that was a bit, for some people, like a stay of execution. And actually, they've lived throughout the pandemic knowing that as soon as that ban was lifted, they're going to be evicted. Local authorities all across the country have a massive backlog of people who need temporary accommodation because eviction is happening to them now that it's allowed to happen again. There are people who've fallen into rent arrears because during the pandemic maybe they lost their job, or maybe they were furloughed and that 20% of income that they lost meant that they could no longer afford their rent, or they had to make that choice. We hear it a lot, don't we? The choice between heating or eating, or the choice between eating and paying the rent. And it's become a bit of a cliche because it's been used so much. But it's not a cliche, it's a reality for many people in our communities. And often it can be hidden away because people maybe who've been saying, I don't want to go to a food bank, so instead I won't pay my rent. That's much more hidden. That's something that people are keeping quiet about because they're ashamed or embarrassed, or they've got their head buried in the sand and they're just hoping that something's going to happen that's going to make it all okay again. Even with food prices, I mean, any of us who've done a shop recently, you'll notice it, won't you? How much more it's costing you just to buy the essentials. Milk's gone up 20% already and is predicted to go up to by another 50% in the next 6 months. Kind of basic food like tomatoes, eggs, most types of meat, pasta. These things have gone up massively in price with no sign that they're going to come down again. In fact, some supermarkets have stopped selling their value ranges because they won't really make a profit on those anymore. So they've just taken them off the shelves. And there's been a campaign to get them put back on the shelves. But as far as I know at the moment, only one supermarket has done that and put them back. So while supermarkets are posting about their massive profits, your average person is being hit hard. And some people literally cannot afford just the extra 50p it might be on one item. You add that up over many, many items. And when you get to the checkout, what are you supposed to do? There was an article, I don't know if you saw it last week, where one of the supermarkets was saying that people are now saying to the people on the checkout, when it hits £30, please stop bringing things through. So they're putting things on the, the conveyor belt thing in order in which they need it, and saying, please stop ringing stuff through the till when it reaches £30, because that's all the money that I've got. I've got a friend who basically is saying, I've cut back on everything I possibly could. I don't know what else to do. We've sat having dinner recently, and in tears, she's saying to me, I already didn't have my heating on. I already used blankets and jumpers instead of heating. I already try and save money every single place I could think of. She's like, literally, the only thing I can think to do right now is to go down to one meal a day. Because other than that, I don't see how I'm going to survive and keep paying my bills. This is a reality for people in our communities right now. Councils across the country are saying they are expecting a tidal wave of homelessness to come in the next year. As Christians, how are we to respond to that? Because it's not all our responsibility, but it absolutely is our responsibility to get involved. It's on the heart of God. It's not an optional extra for Christians to do when we've done our religious duties of like coming to church on a Sunday and praying and reading the Bible. It's the heart of the gospel, is that those that have no hope without us, that we would step in anointed by the Spirit to lift them out of their situation, to bring freedom. What about the second group, though? The guilty and imprisoned. Well, it's easy to look around society and think there are people we can blame for their own situation. So a while ago, I was in overwhelming debt. Overwhelming debt is basically defined as debt that you can't make any sort of headway into clearing the debt. Like for years and years and years, it looks like you're going to be stuck with it. So overwhelming debt is usually when you can only pay off the interest and you're not making any kind of dents into the debt itself. Now, if I told you about all the reasons that I got into debt, I think some of them you'd feel great sympathy for me. Some of them were things like I actually couldn't pay my rent. I was working 3 jobs, and that was not enough to cover all the bills that I had. But at the same time, I smoked. And even if I hadn't smoked, I still wouldn't have been able to pay the bills. But I smoked. I chose to smoke. Well, I say chose. Once I'd started, I was addicted, so it didn't feel like a choice. But that's how it was. I was also would have prioritised going out and partying over paying a bill, because that was my lifestyle at the time. I was a backslidden Christian. I was far away from God. And so my debt actually spread over, I got into debt over a period of about 6 years. Some of it I couldn't have controlled. I was going to get into debt no matter what. But some of it was entirely my own fault. It was about decisions I made. It was things I chose to spend money on that other people would have looked at me and said, well, don't spend money on that then. You know, I used to have that conversation with my mum all the time, because to her, she was just like, she's not a Christian, but it was blindingly obvious to her. And probably to most people, if you don't want to be in debt, don't spend money on things you don't have to spend money on. So just like the second category here, I was bound up. I was trapped in debt. Actually, Jeremy's dad, who is was a solicitor, he advised me to declare myself bankrupt because he said, I can't see any way out of this mess for you. This was when I came back to God and the church was trying to help me get out of the state that I'd been in. And Jeremy's dad gave me that advice, which was really, really good advice. But my mum worked for a bank and she said, please don't do that because I know what that's going to leave you with for years. And in the end, I got a job within 2 weeks of that. And so I decided to just try and hold on and pay off my debt. And through that, I would say God taught me how to get good with money. I'd been really bad with money, and God taught me how to be good with money. So there is some truth in that if you learn to budget, for some people, you might be okay. But actually, the fact is there were situations I got myself in and I knew it was my own fault. And when I came back to God, I really wrestled with this. God, can I ask you to help me out of a mess that is entirely of my own making? Isn't it wonderful that the answer to that question is always yes? That God always wants to help us out of a mess, even if it's our own making. And then the third category, the foolish. These are people who make the same bad decisions over and over and over again. And probably we all know people like that, don't we? We probably all know people who make the same bad decisions over and over again. And we think, why do you do that? I've got a friend who is on the streets in Hastings, and he has had help for his addiction. He's an alcoholic. He's had help quite a few times. And every time he comes out of rehab or whatever, he goes back and he hangs out with the same group of people and he gets back into the same patterns of behaviour. And you think, even he would say, I've been given lots of chances, but I just want to go back and be with my friends. And so there's bits of it that are understandable, and then there's bits of it about, why do you keep making the same bad choice? There's a guy who came to our food bank in Hastings, and he said to me, it was the winter before the pandemic, and our food bank was overrun. It was so busy. It was the busiest we'd ever seen it, and we weren't prepared for it. And this guy came, and he was struggling with how busy it was, and he had some threatening behaviour. So our food bank manager came to me and said, can you take him out of this space and go and sit with him somewhere? So I did that, and as soon as we sat down together, he said to me, I just want to let you know that if I have to hurt you to get help, I will. I thought, great. They've chosen literally the smallest person to go and sit with this guy. And I was sat there, and you know what, the funny thing was, I didn't feel afraid. He said it really, really calmly, but then I thought, maybe that's worrying. I said to him, I'll go and get you a sandwich and a drink, just wait here for me. And I quickly ran back to the food bank and said to the food bank manager, can someone else come and sit with us as well? And he was like, look, we're getting slammed here, no one else is available, you're just going to have to go and sit with him. So I went back to him, and he told me that no other organisation in the town will help him. He said, they won't help me because I'm violent, and I've been violent to them, and they won't help me because of the way I treat people and because of the fact I keep doing the same things again and again. And I didn't believe him, to be honest. I believed him that he was violent, I just didn't believe him that no one else would help him. So I went and started ringing round different organisations in the town. This guy had just told me that he was homeless, that he was going to be sleeping on the streets that night. He was dressed in jeans and a hoodie, and it was November, and they were saying that night temperatures were going to drop below freezing. And he had a carrier bag with, I don't know what was in it, but it wasn't more clothing. It certainly wasn't a sleeping bag or anything like that. And I went and I started calling all these different organisations. So I called the local authority and said, you've got a statutory responsibility to house the homeless. They said, we know him, and he's not eligible. He doesn't fit the criteria. If he sleeps outside for 3 nights in a row when the temperatures are below freezing, then we have to help him. And I said to them, if he sleeps outside for 3 nights in a row and temperatures below freezing, he's going to die. I'm like, I can't see how that doesn't happen. And they said, and the woman I spoke to, actually, I know her, and it's not that she lacks compassion. She said, I'm not allowed to help him. We've got rules and we have to follow them. No flexibility whatsoever. that was what I found with all of the statutory organisations. He was right. They did all know him, and for various reasons, they wouldn't help him. And some of those reasons, one of the organisations I phoned said, we can't because he's violent to both men and women, and we only have shared accommodation, so we can't take the risk. We've got nowhere we can put him in his own room. I phoned a charity in the town. It's a secular charity, but I know them to be one of the best charities in the town in terms of helping the most vulnerable. And they said, we know him. He's too violent. We can't help him. We've helped him over and over and over again. We can't help him anymore. And I remember sitting there with this guy thinking, we're your only hope. The church is literally your only hope. If we turn you away, you have got no other avenue. There's nowhere else you're going to find mercy, grace, or compassion. So we helped him. And that was a journey actually of helping him, getting him in accommodation. First of all, putting him in a hotel, walking with him, trying to not be affected by his violence and things like that, and trying to do whatever we could to be safe. But knowing that actually if we don't help him, if we don't take some of the risk actually, then this guy has no hope and nowhere to find help. And then the final group in this psalm, the storm battered. During the pandemic, I think one of the things that's really surprised me is seeing how many people have encountered poverty for the first time in our communities, people who are utterly shell-shocked. So like a woman I know who, she basically turned up at the food bank and you could tell she didn't know what had hit her. She said to me, I've had a very lucrative career in the media, self-employed, and her business just collapsed overnight when coronavirus came. She said to me, I own a massive house, but that's not helpful to me right now because I've got no money to put food on the table for my kids. Her business literally collapsed overnight, and you could see she had no idea, other than knowing that the only reason she knew about the food bank is because she used to donate to it in her local supermarket. She would drop tins in the basket as she left. So that was the only place she thought, I know that that's where I can get help. She had no idea how to navigate the system because she'd never had to. And she said to me, I have given to this food bank time and time again. I have never, ever considered that I would need to be here right now. There are those who are just storm battered by this season of life, by the pandemic, by the cost of living crisis. And, you know, my friend I mentioned who's gone down to one meal a day because it's the only thing she can think to do to save any more money. This would be true, of course, of Ukrainian refugees suddenly needing to flee their homes, and obviously many refugees from other nations too that don't get as much news headlines but are leaving their nations at the same time right now trying to come here to find safety. There are those who are storm battered by circumstances beyond their control. What I love about Psalm 107 is that God's response to every group of people is exactly the same. Is exactly the same. He says, what does it say? Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. Every single group. Every single group. And what I find really fascinating, actually, is that it's the foolish are the only ones who tell of his works with songs of joy. There's different responses from each group, but the foolish are the ones who get to tell of his works with songs of joy. And I think that's my own story. I can look back at so many times in my life, not just in the dim and distant past, but even more recent times where I've made foolish decisions because I'm human and I'm still sinful. Even though Jesus has nailed all my sins to the cross, I still make foolish decisions sometimes. But I get to be someone who sings for joy at the work of the Lord in my life because he comes and rescues me from my distress. And that obviously, in one sense, that's a one-time thing when we put our faith in Jesus, that he comes and rescues us from our distress. But God rescues me from my distress time and time and time again as well. It's so beautiful that he is so merciful, so kind, so tender-hearted. Whatever situation we are in, whether you're in something right now or you know people around you who are, God's response is the same. If we will come and we will cry to him in our trouble, his promise is, I will deliver you from your distress. It's so incredibly kind and gracious of God that no matter how we got ourselves into whatever mess we're in, the only thing we bring is we cry to him in our trouble, and he comes and delivers us from our distress. Tim Keller says this, American preacher, says this: about this psalm. Despite their radically different situations, there was one common factor. Everyone who cried to God was heard. Behold how he loves us. Isn't that lovely? Isn't that wonderful? But actually, what's our response then as Christians to this? Firstly, it's that we sing for joy because we've been rescued from our distresses. But also, it's then that we become imitators of God and we look to relieve the distress of others, no matter how they got into their situation. And I think that's really, really hard because I know for me, I am much more naturally judgmental than I am naturally merciful. If you ran a discipleship course in your church on how to be judgmental, I would not need to come on it. I can do it all on my own. It seems somehow it just comes so naturally to me to look at someone in front of me and think, oh, I wonder how you got here. To ask people to tell their stories and then to be assessing, oh, so you made some bad choices. That comes really naturally to me. But to push into mercy, that's what God is calling me and calling us as Christians to do. For those of us who follow Jesus, he said in Luke 6, verse 36, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Just as your Father is merciful. Someone prayed it earlier, thank you that your mercies are new every day. That's what the mercy of God looks like. And we're invited to be like that with new mercies every day. The guy I mentioned that every other organisation wouldn't help him. We get to show him new mercies every single day. Now, of course, we might think carefully about how we do it. We might think with wisdom, what's the best approach here? But I find so often I jump to the what's the wise thing here, and I almost use that as an excuse to not be merciful. Because it's easier to say, oh, if someone's begging on the streets and I give you money, I don't know what you're going to do with it, than it is to say, how can I show you the mercy of God today? It's a totally different question. It's a totally different starting place. I want to start with what's my responsibility as a follower of Jesus. And my responsibility is to be merciful just as my Father is merciful. So that means I don't think, I wonder what you're going to do with what I do to help you. It means I think, let me show you mercy and I'll find a way. I'll put the responsibility on myself to find a way to show you mercy today. We are invited in. In fact, at the end of this psalm, the last two verses say this, the upright see and rejoice, but all the wicked shut their mouths. Let the one who is wise heed these things and ponder the loving deeds of the Lord. We get to be those who see and rejoice. We see what God is like and we rejoice in it and we sing for joy. But also we get to be those who heed and ponder the ways of God and seek to imitate him and be like him in his ways. Because so often when we read a psalm like this, we cast ourselves in the role of the poor or the foolish or the storm-tossed or whatever it might be. We put ourselves on that end. But if we're followers of Jesus, our role in the story has changed. We were the foolish. We were the hungry and homeless. We were those wandering, looking for somewhere to settle, spiritually speaking, if in no other way. We were those who the storms of life just threw us around. But now, we are those who've been delivered from our distress, and we are raised up and lifted up that we might deliver others from their distress too. We are called to see ourselves in a different role in the story. We're invited to be imitators of our Father in heaven. Isn't that mind-blowing? That we're actually told we can be like God in these things. We can be merciful like he's merciful, which means we've got new mercies each day for the same people who make the same mistakes. It means we grow in becoming those who are rich in mercy, because the Bible says God is rich in mercy. And that's hard. It's not an easy thing. It's something we have to give ourselves to. Certainly if you're anything like me, like I say, I don't have to give myself to being judgmental. That happens with no effort on my part whatsoever. But if I want to be more and more like God, if I want to be more and more merciful, I have to push into it. I have to cultivate it. I have to come before God and say, give me your heart, because I'm not like you in that way. And if I'm going to become like you, it's got to be a work of the Spirit in my life. But the good news is that the Spirit is at work in our lives. We are anointed by the Spirit of God to bring good news to the poor and the broken. I think the wonderful news from this psalm for any of us who are in any way in poverty at the moment or experiencing any level of brokenness in our lives, is that we can cry out to God knowing he promises to deliver us. But beyond that, we are now those who get to go and deliver others as well. Our compassion is based not on the person in front of us. It's based on the compassion of God for us. It's totally different where we start. And it's what sets us apart as Christians. Because actually, we don't have a monopoly on compassion. Lots of people are compassionate. Lots of people are kind. Lots of people want to do good to those in poverty. But as Christians, it's actually becoming imitators of the mercy of God that goes above and beyond. That's one of our distinctives as Christians. That means we keep going when other organisations can't or won't. It's actually a privilege. It's not something we have to do. It's something we get to do. We get to become more and more and more like our Father in heaven. We get to rescue the distressed. We get to come alongside people and say, others may say this is completely your fault, and we agree with them, but we're going to help you anyway. It's a work of the heart. It's something that starts in our hearts with a decision to say, God, I want to be like you in these things. So I wonder if I could finish by praying for us, if that's all right. If you think, do you know what, God, I need you to work in my heart in this way so that I can become more like you, then I wonder if you'd actually stand, just because I think it's helpful to do something to move ourselves and say, God, I want to adopt a posture of saying, I need your help in this way. What don't you do, if raising your hands is helpful to you, if putting your hand on your heart, whatever you find helpful, just adopt that posture where you're like, God, I want to meet with you. I want to be changed by you. I want to line my heart up with your heart. Father, we are so grateful that you have delivered us from our distress. Thank you that, like Jeremy prayed earlier, all we brought is our sin. But thank you that when we turn to you, you have delivered us from our distress, and that has eternal repercussions for us, but it also has daily repercussions for us. Thank you for your mercy that you have lavished upon us for every awful situation we found ourselves in, every hard situation, God, whether it was our fault or whether we were just a victim of circumstances. Thank you, your response is the same, that you deliver us in our distress. We're so grateful for who you are. And what an astonishing, wonderful, beautiful truth that you have drawn us in so that we can be like you. That you've called us to be co-labourers with Christ, to do your work, to reflect your heart. What an astonishing privilege, God. But we know that we need your help. I know I need your help, God. My heart is so judgmental, and I want it to be more and more like your heart of mercy. God, would you come and would you transform us? Would you change us? God, where even those of us who give ourselves to helping the poorest, we've all got those people who we find it harder to help. So would you come and work in our hearts? Would we look to you, not to the person in front of us, not to how they got in their mess, but to you and your mercy and your kindness and your compassion? And would you make us more like you in Jesus' name? Amen.